You didn't see a customer. You saw a black man and decided he was a criminal. Did he look like a criminal? Was that why her eyes lingered on him the second she stepped into the store? Or had she already decided before she even saw his face? Officer Rebecca Hayes had made plenty of arrests before. Most suspects didn't fight back. Most didn't even question her authority. But when Marcus Hale walked into that courtroom, standing tall, unshaken, she knew, this time, she had made a mistake. Had he done something wrong? Marcus replayed every step in his mind. He had scanned each item, paid at the self-checkout, taken his receipt. Was it the way he moved? The way he dressed? Or was it simply the fact that he was there at all? Because the second Officer Hayes entered the convenience store, her eyes were on him. "Sir, I need you to stop right there." "Why?" Marcus turned, confused. The officer stood a few feet away, her fingers resting on the grip of her holstered weapon. "Is there a problem?" Her expression remained unreadable, but something about her stance told him she had already made up her mind. "Just saw you put something in your pocket after scanning a few items. Mind showing me your receipt?" Was she serious? Marcus frowned, adjusting the bag in his hand. "I just paid." "You can check the register." She didn't even blink. "I said, show me your receipt." Would it even matter? Still, he reached into his bag, pulled out the small slip of paper, and held it out. She grabbed it, barely glancing at the text before shaking her head. "Nice try. Empty your pockets." Why did she even bother checking if she had already decided he was guilty? The store had gone silent. A few customers watched from a distance, their faces unreadable. Were they curious? Afraid? Or just used to seeing things like this? Marcus kept his voice calm. "I don't have anything in my pockets." Hayes' patience snapped, hands against the counter. Would arguing make things worse? Would silence? "I told you I didn't take anything," he said, voice steady. Her hand dropped to her radio. "I've got a possible shoplifting suspect resisting compliance." Resisting? How was standing still resisting? A store clerk, a young man in a company vest, hesitated before stepping forward. I actually saw him pay for everything." Would that be enough? Hayes didn't even turn her head. "Stay out of this." Of course not. Marcus could already see the outcome. The headlines, the assumptions, the quiet murmurs of, well, he must have done something. Could he change that? Could he stop this? "I have a law degree," he said carefully. "I know my rights." Hayes let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah? Well, you can explain your rights downtown." What was the point of knowing the law if no one cared to follow it? Before he could respond, she grabbed his wrist. He had seconds to decide. Would pulling away be resisting? Would demanding a supervisor even matter? Or would it all lead to the same place? The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped against his skin. How many people had stood in this exact spot before him? How many had walked free? A phone screen glowed from the corner of his vision. Someone was recording. Would it help? Would it even matter? Hayes guided him toward the exit. She thought she had won. But did she know who she had just arrested? The ride to the station was silent. Did she feel any doubt? Any hesitation? Or was this just another easy arrestor? Marcus sat in the back of the squad car, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the city. Outside, he had spent his life avoiding trouble, playing by the rules, staying in line. Did that mean nothing? Or did none of it ever really matter? Hayes' fingers tapped idly on the steering wheel, relaxed, casual. She thought this would be routine. She thought it would end like all the others. She had no idea, because this time, the system had picked the wrong man. And this time, someone would answer for it. Marcus Hale handed over his wallet and personal belongings to the officer on duty, without protest. He knew how this worked. He had seen it before too many times. The officer behind the desk, a tired-looking man with graying hair, gave Officer Rebecca Hayes a sideways glance. Serious. Hayes shrugged. Had to detain him. Guy was getting hostile. Marcus clenched his fists. Hostile? He had barely raised his voice. But when a man like him was called hostile, it meant something else entirely. That a younger officer, maybe in his early 30s, flipped through Marcus' wallet. His fingers stopped on a card. He pulled it out, brow furrowing. "You're a lawyer?" Marcus exhaled through his nose. "Yes." Hayes snorted. "Sure he is." The young officer turned the card over, eyes narrowing. "He's telling the truth." He glanced at Hayes. "You sure about this charge?" Hayes' face tightened. He stole from a store. The officer hesitated, then looked at Marcus. "Sir, do you have a lawyer?" Marcus met his gaze. "I don't need one." A slow, almost amused smirk crossed the officer's face. He glanced at Hayes before handing Marcus' wallet back. "You're going to represent yourself?" Marcus nodded. "Absolutely." Hayes let out a sharp breath, irritation flickering across her face. She turned on her heel. "Fine, get him processed." Marcus was led down a hallway past a row of holding cells. He had seen places like this before from the other side. Now he was here, waiting, sitting on the hard bench. He watched the minutes crawl by. He knew their game. Hold him as long as they legally could, pressure him into a plea deal, or let him rot in a cell over the weekend to teach him a lesson. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The door creaked open. A guard stepped in. "You're being arraigned in the morning." Marcus nodded, his mind already working through the strategy. He wouldn't just prove his innocence, he was going to make sure this never happened to another man like him again. Rebecca Hayes, though, she still thought she had already won. She was about to find out just how wrong she was. The courtroom was colder than Marcus expected. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the polished wood of the judge's bench. He sat at the defense table, hands folded neatly in front of him. The weight of the cuffs from the night before still lingered on his wrists. Across the room, Officer Rebecca Hayes stood confidently, her uniform crisp, her expression unreadable to her. This was routine, that a simple case of a shoplifter who got caught, processed, convicted. She hadn't even bothered to check the name on the docket. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, adjusted her glasses and glanced at the prosecution. "Let's move this along. What are the charges?" The prosecutor, a young man with an overconfident smirk, stood. "Your Honor, the defendant, Marcus Hale, was caught stealing from a local convenience store. Officer Hayes witnessed the crime firsthand and detained him after he refused to comply." Marcus let out a quiet breath, shaking his head slightly. The lies had started early. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Hale, do you have legal representation?" Marcus stood, buttoning his suit jacket with steady hands. "I do, Your Honor." A murmur rippled through the small audience in the back. Even the prosecutor's smug expression faltered slightly. Hayes barely reacted. The judge nodded. "Very well. Mr. Hale, how do you plead?" Marcus met her gaze. "Not guilty." His voice was firm, unwavering. The judge glanced toward the prosecution. "Let's hear the officer's testimony." Hayes stepped forward, a picture of confidence. "Your Honor, I was on patrol when I entered the convenience store and saw the defendant pocket an item without paying. I approached him and asked to see his receipt, which he failed to produce. He then became argumentative and refused to comply with my instructions." Marcus tilted his head slightly that he had heard bad testimonies before. But this was particularly sloppy. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Hale, you may cross-examine." Marcus stood, adjusting his tie. He took a step forward, hands resting lightly on the defense table. "Officer Hayes, you said you saw me take an item and put it in my pocket?" "Yes." "And you claim I didn't produce a receipt?" "That's correct." Marcus nodded, pacing slowly. "Were there security cameras in the store?" Hayes hesitated for just a second. But Marcus caught it. Yes. But that footage hasn't been reviewed yet." He turned to the prosecutor. "Did your office request the footage?" The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. "It wasn't deemed necessary at the time." Marcus let that sit for a moment. "Officer Hayes, you also stated that I refused to comply. In what way?" Hayes straightened. "You became aggressive. Refused to empty your pockets when asked. Resisted when I attempted to detain you." Marcus pressed his lips together, nodding. "Interesting." He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit A into evidence, my purchase receipt, which was in my possession at the time of arrest." He walked over to the bailiff, handing over the neatly folded slip of paper. The judge examined it, her brows lifting slightly. "This receipt shows that Mr. Hale did, in fact, pay for all of his items." She glanced over her glasses at Hayes. "Officer, did you examine this at the time of the arrest?" Hayes' posture stiffened. I must have overlooked it." Marcus turned back to her. "You must have overlooked it?" His voice was even, but the pressure in the room had shifted. "Officer, do you have any body cam footage of the arrest?" Hayes hesitated again. "My body cam was malfunctioning." The judge's eyes narrowed. "You didn't mention that in your report." Marcus folded his arms. "So no body cam footage. No security footage reviewed. And a receipt proving my innocence that was ignored." He let out a low chuckle. "Tell me, Officer Hayes, were you absolutely sure I stole something? Or did you just decide I looked like someone who would?" A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room that Hayes' face flushed, her hands balling into fists at her sides. But this was just the beginning. The real unraveling was about to begin. The courtroom felt different now. The air was charged, the tension thick. The once confident prosecutor sat stiffly, flipping through his notes as if searching for an argument that no longer existed. Officer Rebecca Hayes stood motionless, her jaw clenched, her hands curled into tight fists. But Marcus Hale wasn't finished. "Officer Hayes," he said, pacing slowly, his voice steady. "When you detained me, you claimed I resisted. Can you describe exactly how I resisted?" Hayes hesitated. You refused to comply." Marcus tilted his head. "I refused to comply? Or did I simply ask questions you didn't like?" Hayes' throat bobbed as she swallowed. "You wouldn't empty your pockets." Marcus nodded, stepping closer. "And yet, you never actually saw me take anything. You never reviewed the store's security footage. You ignored my receipt. And conveniently, your body camera malfunctioned." The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I believe." But the judge raised a hand, silencing him. Her sharp gaze never left Hayes. "Officer, how do you justify this arrest when key evidence proving the defendant's innocence was in his possession at the time?" Hayes opened her mouth, then shut it. Marcus took one last step forward, his voice calm but unyielding. "Tell me, Officer Hayes, when you saw me in that store, did you see a man? Or just a suspect?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Someone in the back let out a quiet gasp. Hayes' face burned red. The judge sighed, rubbing her temples. "I find it deeply concerning that this case proceeded with such a lack of due process. The absence of reviewed footage, the dismissal of exculpatory evidence, and the inconsistencies in Officer Hayes' testimony raised serious concerns." She turned to the prosecutor, who now looked as if he wished he were anywhere else. "Counselor, do you wish to proceed with these charges?" The prosecutor hesitated for a moment, then exhaled sharply. "Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges." The words landed like a gavel strike that a weight lifted from Marcus' chest, but he didn't celebrate. This wasn't a victory. It was just survival. The judge nodded. "Case dismissed." She turned to Hayes. "Officer, I expect Internal Affairs will be taking a very close look at your conduct. I strongly suggest you prepare." Marcus turned toward Hayes. She was still standing, frozen, her mouth slightly open as if she had something to say, but no words to form it. "You didn't see a crime," Marcus said, his voice quiet but cutting. "You saw a black man and decided that was enough." Hayes flinched. She knew it was true. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Marcus gathered his things. This wasn't just about him. For every Marcus Hale who could fight back, there were countless others who couldn't. And now, someone was finally going to answer for that. The system had picked the wrong man. And this time, the system lost.